Hi, it's Sally-Shakti, your Star Priestess and Visionary Writing Guide, and welcome to Writing and Thriving for Visionary Writers. And today I am very happy to welcome Camilla Nelson, my good friend and poet. And Camilla is and performer and many other things and PhD. And Camilla's going to start by telling us a little bit about herself and her practice, and then we'll get into some questions and conversation. So over to you, Camilla. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to be here. So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a language artist. So I work with language as the kind of focus of my practice, but more and more it ends up being kind of multidimensional because I'm really interested in how language is a material thing and how it is continuous with all of the life forms around us and our own life form and force as well. Because for so many years, language and writing and was so associated with logic, and that was something that kind of set us apart from the animate world. And most of my work really is about kind of trying to reestablish those connections. So
That's
oh
so
yeah.
exciting. Sorry. I thought you wanted me to jump in, and I was just so excited because that's like the most exciting thing that you possibly could have said to start us off. So I'm really excited about reestablishing that connection between, what you just said there, language, especially poetry. It was the high language art. It was, as you said, something that separated this kind of idea of human intellectual intelligence from the embodied world of ourselves, our own microbiome, microorganisms, and the world around us that we embody and inhabit and are part of and participate in. So please take us deeper into that. Tell us how you started, and how you got into this juicy subject.
Mm. So I was a modernist originally. I was really into, Virginia Woolf and James Joyce and T.S. Eliot and all of that kind of like crashing and breaking that was happening particularly in Europe in the early 20th century. And but all of this was really urban experiment. And I was somebody who really enjoyed and got a lot from being in a rural environment. And I always felt this conflict. I really loved all this formal experimentation, but I didn't really see why the formal experimentation couldn't happen in a rural context, couldn't happen with animate subject matter rather than and there are various like obvious reasons about kind of, it's new and exciting, and all of this technology was the kind of fresh on the scene in the early 20th century. But now we find ourselves, a century on, in a very different place, and seeing what all of that technology has done, and kind of needs to reconnect. And what I felt was that that formal experimentation, that kind of like breaking apart of what language is a it's a creative critical act. And it just felt like that's what needed to happen. We needed to kind of like reuse those tools and techniques, but in a different setting in relation to a kind of different subject matter. And so that's what I started doing at the beginning. That's how I came up, I think, with the idea of the PhD that I did at Dartington started that in 2019. So that was, I mean, it sounds like a bit of a bonkers title, but it was Reading and Writing with a Tree, Practicing Nature Writing as Inquiry. So the idea was, rather than starting with a book or a set text, which would be, that was what I was used to as a literary student. You would start with a particular you know focused literary subject matter and break it apart and think about it critically. I wanted to sort of transpose or apply the literary techniques and the critical techniques that we would use in a literary context onto something that was obviously not a literary object. Because it was obviously a very intuitive decision, because at that stage I was thinking, why am I even doing this? This feels completely bonkers. And I remember going to various conferences at the time where, in quite kind of established red brick universities, and people very much were like, okay, you're a slightly odd tree hugging person. And that was really strange for me, because that wasn't the background that I was coming from. I was coming from a very like classical academic background, but I just felt like we really needed to shift the paradigm, and that needed to be quite kind of radically addressed, and so I felt like, okay, we need to there's something about these environments, the reading and writing environment that humans inhabit, in which like this sort of particular form of language is produced, and the environment of the tree. Like they're pretty antithetical to each other, to be honest. Like the written page does not survive well in a tree environment, and a tree does not survive in a library, for example. So that was the kind of thing I was sort of really, as with all, I suppose, research projects, you have an inkling of something that feels promising, but obviously you don't know the outcome. You don't really know where it's going to go. And so what I ended up doing, thank goodness, I did actually find something that I felt like it was actually doing what I was aiming to do. But the sort of final outcome, one of the final outcomes of that was the apple tree that I was working with. I realized that there were two forms of working with the apples and creating writing with the apples. And when I say with, there is a definite kind of like ratio of like how much, which organism is creating the line or the writing. So with apples, you're used to seeing, if you drop them on the floor, they bruise. So they are mark making, they have agency of their own. They create their own marks. And I was sitting with all of these apples on my desk and watching how they were, creasing and cracking, and how there were sort of indents from insects and other history is essentially like written into them. And or that's the way I was thinking about it, because I was sort of seeing everything through the lens of language and writing. And I started writing into it. And of course, the apple will bruise along the line. I was just writing very relatively lightly with pencil, and the apple bruised. And so I suddenly realized that this was a kind of real turning point, at which I was like, okay, I am marking into the surface of the apple, but the apple is creating the difference in coloration that actually makes this visible. So there is something about that coming together of sort of two, I want to say almost skins, but it was through the kind of impression of the pencil on the skin of the apple, and the organism of the apple was responding to that. And so that's really where I was getting at. I was sort of like, how can we even think about sort of human writing as a co-writing, and what would that mean for us? What does that mean for language production? And so the kind of creative outcome was that I ended up writing a single word into every apple on this apple tree. And then as the apples grow, some of the lines healed over. The apples obviously move in relationship to each other. So it's not that the tree is thinking about like, oh, I want for to be next to thee, like that's not what's happening. But that was part of the project of like how these different agencies work, how our intentions are sort of almost, actually, to be honest, it always feels a little bit like the organism I'm working with is like a critical partner in it, even though there isn't an intention in the same way that there is a human intention. That kind of pushback, I will have an expectation or an intention, and create an action and wait for the response and wait for what I'm going to learn from it. And so that was what I was learning, was how the movement of the apples through the growth, through the falling of one, which is registering the wind, which is registering all sorts of things in terms of the nutrition and nourishment of the tree itself. How all of this life process can be part of a kind of literally like thinking of a writing, a piece of writing or a form of writing as a living system, and it still feels quite clunky, and like I'm, have developed my thinking from there. But that was really, really instrumental in terms of sort of forcing these two, the kind of human mark making and writing process together with a kind of non-human, animate, vibrant, living being, and learning where we are blind to the needs, the kind of I mean, I suppose the kind of animate context of these other beings. And so rather than writing about something and kind of replacing the thing itself with human language, what happens when you try and work with it, and how does that reform human language?
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that part of your process and your thinking. There are so many different ways we can go with this. And one thing I just want to go back to touch on is when you said that this is quite a basic point, but when you said that, like, paper and human writing doesn't survive very well in that environment, I know that's also part of what you did for your project. You put the words around the tree, is that right? And some of them decomposed, so you wrote some words on paper and some decomposed and some didn't, and you created a poem out of that.
Yeah, that was some of the, I mean, there were lots of different processes, but yeah, certainly one of the kind of earlier things was taking poems or fragments that I'd written about my experience of being with the tree outside, and seeing how not just the weather, but like slugs and snails, I mean, they're great reformers of text, because they eat away at the ink and the page. And yeah, and so sort of seeing how that context was rewriting, and that really developed a lot more in a Jana narrative, where it was very much about recomposition and the forest and the woodland itself kind of growing up through the text and becoming part of the pages. But that was a kind of slightly later project.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that project and how that project emerged, because I'm really interested in what you're telling us about the agency of the living world, if I can put it that way. And even though, yes, an apple or an apple tree has not necessarily the same set of intentions to set out and write a poem in the way that a person would, when we remove ourselves from that stagnant context of sitting at a desk in a library, and now I'm going to surround myself with lots of words and write other words, when we take ourselves into an environment where we have more of an organic connection with the agency of the living world, different forms of writing, different forms of process and practice and poetry arise. And what's also bound up in this question for me is what you're describing. And again, going back to the beginning of your practice, you chose a path around modernism as a but the modernism of the early 20th century was very much connected to the urban environment. What I'm interested in as well is that the kind of poetry that was connected to the rural environment was much more pastoral, romantic, and there is a form of eco-poetics that's emerged along those lines. Your work seems to be doing something different, so perhaps you can talk around that and situate that within the project of a Jana narrative, for example.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a lovely way of framing actually that, because I think what I was interested in was not just the formal disintegration and the kind of the you know, conjoining or the kind of mishmash. You know, this is where, even though collage was something that had happened, and that was kind of, I can't remember the woman's name actually who created it, and it was actually a Victorian practice, and it was started by a woman and was a, you know, a female domestic practice, but that was taken up more famously by artists like Picasso and Braque, and, you know, the sort of famous white men that we know about. But that was really instrumental for me in thinking about, oh wow, words are objects, words are things, you know, like whether it's breath coming out of my body, you know, this breath that is being registered on this software, you know, it's all physical, it's our surroundings that are kind of reverberating, and my body that is reverberating, and so and the technology that is registering this. So, you know, language is only possible because of a particular interaction between material bodies and processes, and on a kind of physical well, a kind of visual level, or a kind of more obviously sort of material level, writing is a real is maybe more obvious in that way, because you have that you know, paper form, the printed form, the painted form, the written form, and, you know, it makes a difference what the word is made of. If it's made of, you know, a writing in blood is a very different thing from a writing in stone. You know, like all of this material, all of this interaction with particular materials means something different. And so to come back to your point about how the way I'm thinking about language is different to a kind of more pastoral sort of like more straightforward narrative, or kind of continuous way of using language. I was really influenced by, I mean, as I said, you know, that kind of famous phrase, the crashing and breaking, that kind of tearing apart that was obviously, you know, so influenced and formed by the world wars that were happening, and how that kind of, you know, that terrible tearing apart of bodies that was happening. But the, you know, the sort of incisions almost, or the kind of tearing apart of time and space as well, you know, with the telephone and the beginning of airplane travel, and you know, all of this kind of relationship had suddenly changed. It was, everything was speeding up very quickly. We would get, you know, sort of the microscopes and telescopes, and our whole kind of relation had shifted. And what we see in kind of classical modernism is how that affects language, how language starts falling apart. You know, you have that you know, kind of shoring fragments against your ruin that T.S. Eliot talks about, you know, how language begins to fall apart. And a lot of that was obviously influenced by the psychological dimensions of war, of these kind of like shifting social and technological dimensions. You know, that affects the body, that affects how we are as people. And of course, that will come out in language. And so that's what I'm really interested in. And sort to reiterate in a kind of in another way, I suppose, is how language itself, how the forming of syntax in a kind of poetic context, because that's really where I'm coming from, registers that like friction and tension, and particularly with a Jana narrative, I was interested in how the animate world becomes the agent that creates that change, that creates that falling apart. Because, you know, in modernist, classical modernism, it was all the technologies, it was this terrible wars that were happening. And this time it feels like what is happening is climate breakdown. You know, like we're in a, you know, climate emergency. And how do we allow, or how do we, it's not even allow because it's happening all the time, how do we find ways in which the animate world can inform our human language use, so we're trying to speak with, rather than just I mean, alongside is also, is also kind of good, but that sense that, yeah, that sense that we are kind of, we are, one of a very few, well, we are a very small part of a large, massive ecosystem. And how does that register in our language? How do we incorporate that kind of huge anima agency into, how does that register in human language? So my attempt in a yarn and narrative, and this was quite soon after the PhD, so it was still, it was a good, decade ago. But I was thinking about that, how, what we do, I was trying to do sort of what I do to my human language is what I have done to the non-human world. So I was walking around a yarn wood in Dartmoor in Devon, and the invitation was by Karen Pearson, part of her assemblage work with Natural England. So it's a managed woodland, and the invitation was to create work that would be outdoors in a particular route around this woodland. And I am really terrible at narrowing things down. I'm a real kind of wanting to sort of, oh my goodness, I'm, enthusiast, wanting like everything to be part of it. Oh, look at these ants. This is so exciting. How can the ants create a poem? Oh, look at how there's these, badger tracks or fox tracks. What if I put a poem out and how will that rearrange itself? So I had about kind of 12 different sites around this woodland. And what I tried to do was I took a sample of material from each site. And again, like running through all of this, I'm very aware that I'm not a scientist. It's being a creative person is a very different thing, but it's sort of sometimes like playful and helpful, or helpful to me anyway, to sort of almost borrow bits from a kind of scientific, the idea of kind of taking a sample, it feels like a scientific kind of ecological thing, but then to use that paradigm or to use that technique in a very like non-scientific way. And so I had all these little bags of kind of from each site. And what I did was I wrote in relation to that site where I was. I printed out that writing, and then I cut up the pieces of text from that I'd written from that each site, and combined it with the materials from the site itself. And I remade it. So I put it all, for those of you who are familiar with like paper making, you have to create a lot of I mean, it's a bit of a kind of cheat really, because often you're using paper to reform the page. So it's pulped material. It can be different fibers, but it's usually pulped paper. So I pulped the poem, kept some fragments there, and I pulped it with the material from the site. So every single page, so I created a page from each site that incorporated this kind of like mishmash of human language and page making with materials from the site. So the idea was that it was sort of some kind of like combination. And I'm aware that it was very much, like my agency, my intention. It was a very kind of like actually quite mechanical process. I'm using a sort of food processor to do a lot of this. And then once it was formed, I took each page back to the site where it was and left it there. And I think I left it there for a week and took photographs before and after to see what happened, how it fell apart. And then the book, A Yarn and Narrative, came out, and it's a actually I was so grateful to Contraband, because it's a I don't know, I'm not sure it is called a double bound, but essentially it's got two beginnings. So I was really clear that I wanted to have, that there was no priority, that there was, because on one half there's the kind of more standard printed text, and then if you start at the other side, there is fragments of the kind of falling apart material that that was made from the woodland itself. And so that process of, it was quite a long process, and I did sort of start off with these very kind of laborious, quite painful actually, like paper making is very hard on the body. um and so it was a very kind of like long process, incorporating, like very embodied, very, you're getting cold, you're getting wet, you're muddy, you're kind of like in amongst this material that you're thinking about. But I was using things like, a food processor, as well as obviously kind of thinking about how the material fell apart. But to come back to the syntax and how that affects that, was that I was just really trying to reach towards, in however kind of clumsy a way, reach towards a sort of process, or kind of trying to open my practice up to incorporating agency and intention, however we understand that wasn't human, and really trying to kind of sort of synthesize this disruption, the disruptions that came from the animate world, that came from the woodland, and see how that registered in language. So that was very long.
No, I loved it. Thank you. I mean, what that brings up for me is that, in human language, and I'm specifically speaking about the English language, the way that the English language is structured is that our syntax will place the speaker at the center of the sentence, and therefore really at the center of the world. It's a very egocentric language. I do this to you, and the relationship that forms, the relationships that creates with other people and other beings and other forms of living, like you said, the animate world. The English language specifically is the language that I know best, centers the speaker in this very kind of egocentric way, in which I'm the subject and everything else is the object. Everything else is dehumanized or depersonalized, in a way that I'm the one with agency when I speak. And I think that's part of the syntax that you are working to kind of explore and explode and undo and recreate, and have intentional, in a way, on your part at least, intentional participation from non-human agents and animate beings, or world, living matter, as part of that, what becomes more of a conversation. It becomes more of a dialogue and a conversation between you and the living world, in a way that, as far as possible, in the ways that you've been able to do it so far, decenters yourself as the subject, and brings in a much more porous relationship with the living world.
Yeah, trying to kind of emphasize that plurality, but every step that we go, every step that we take, you kind of come up against, even the fact that, like, a Yana narrative, I say that I'm interested in plural agency, but it's my name that is on the text, and I did a series of apple works where it was called The Same Apple, where I took, I think it was about 26 apples from a tree and just let them, from the same tree, and because they're cultivars, because they're all sort of well, traditional kind of apple varieties that we know of, or that we intentionally cultivate, are grafted onto rootstocks, so they're clones of each other rather than being kind of like reproduced in the way that humans are usually, like, or other animals and plants reproduce. And so the idea that, like, actually this is the same apple, but just sort of reiterated in particular different parts of the tree, And if it's the same apple, then shouldn't it create the same mark, be essentially the same thing? And what you see in the rotting down of every apple on the page is that they all make different marks, because also it's not about just one apple. It's about the types of molds, the types of bacteria that gets in, whether one is close to the window, all of this kind of stuff. And in that, I did have the kind of realization that I had to start putting in the kind of like author bit, Camilla Nelson plus apple plus mold plus bacteria plus, like all of these things, and just beginning to kind of like recognize, and where do you stop with that? Where do you, because there is so much stuff that is part of what we do and what we make. But even just kind of beginning to try and do that is a kind of step forward in that awareness of being with and being multiple, that so many like authors now are talking about really fluently, and much more with much more erudition than I am. But yeah, we're kind of all getting there together anyway, traveling in the same direction.
Yeah, it's a very organic process, and it's not something that can be easily spoken about with the language that we have and the tools that we've inherited. It's something that is perhaps much more ineffable than we would like to think of ourselves in our, in our forms of education and our formal education. I wonder if we can talk about what's been kind of brewing under the surface of this conversation, is if you can reflect a little bit on how this practice has changed you. How has it kind of got under your skin and affected you personally and through your practice? And maybe you can talk about that in the context of your recent exhibition in Somerset.
Well, to return to the kind of PhD, I was coming to that actually out of my own sort of personal like crashing and breaking. I'd been very, very ill for a number of years and had that, and actually I'd not been able to read as part of that. Like, so my relationship with language had this kind of quite vigorous sort of stuttering, kind of like reforming. And so I was very, as with a lot of illness, and Virginia Woolf talks about this very clearly on her essay on illness, it brings you back into your body. And so again, that's where I was coming from in terms of realizing my body as the material condition for language. And my relationship with the tree and my decision to work with the tree reinforced that really strongly, because when you're reading your way around a tree, you're looking down, you're moving up, you're using your body to read, which is very unusual. We habitually, we sort of forget it, but and we forget the body as we do it. But the reading positions and the reading postures that we take up and the writing postures are very particular. They're sort of to enable us to read and write effectively. And this process of working with the animate world outside of these conditions, the kind of normalized conditions of reading and writing, really helps me to remember my body. And in remembering my body, I feel like that is the portal, that is the point at which you're like, oh yes, I am material, just as all of these things are material. There was never a point of severance. I'm already connected. We are already part of these things. And remembering that is a very, very corporeal thing, and something that is quite slow and totally like fundamental. But I think it does, you've talked a lot about kind of like rupture. I think it does take some kind of quite intense experience to shake you out of the psychology that we sort of started talking about, that we kind of exist independently from the rest of the world, or that we kind of think we think therefore we are, and all of this kind of old paradigms that are actually really culturally embedded in us in Western culture anyway. And so that's just quite slow work. And all of this kind of like breaking things up and mucking into things you know, it's kind of a shortcut. Like you sort of want to get to the thing faster than you actually can. And what I realized is actually here I am, you know, 10 years after, in fact, 12 years after I finished my PhD. And I feel like I have now kind of embodied or sort of developed a practice that really feels more integrated with the things that I was thinking about, you know, like over a decade ago. So this may not be really answering your question, but actually I think, unfortunately, even though we need to move fast to respond to kind of this climate emergency, actually it's really slow work. It's really slow and steady work, being outside, being part of this other world, realizing it. And that's what's really been kind of life-changing. And I know that sounds kind of quite cringy, but it's a like really fundamental paradigm shift that I think we're all, well, you know, you and I anyway, at least, are engaged and kind of committed to. And it is kind of long, slow work. And I feel like I probably haven't addressed your full question.
No, I love that you know, the fast work needs to be done slowly and the slow work needs to be done quickly, and it's the same work, but it's like yeah, there's an urgency to the speed at which we must begin to engage with it, and then we recognize that it is a slowing down that is going to make the profoundest changes internally and externally, and through our relationships with the living world and with living matter. If you're happy to go on a little bit longer, I want to just get into a few more things.
Yeah.
So yeah, just to come back to the question, was how then does that what you've just, you know, what you've spoken about in terms of the development of your practice and you as a person. I came to your recent solo exhibition, well done, in Somerset. Could you tell us about that project and how that's kind of embodied the most recent iteration of the work you've been doing?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so that was really nice. I was able to take the best part of a year really in 2023 to again kind of embody a lot of the becoming work that I'd started during the pandemic. And I had started that with sort of small commission from Sound Art Radio, who had agreed to go ahead with this idea that I would do initially, I think it was 6, I can't remember, 5 or 6 radio shows devoted to thinking about human and non-human relationships. So we started off with becoming fungus, we went becoming insect, becoming bird, becoming animal, and the idea was that we would finish on becoming human. But oh sorry, we also did becoming plant, crucial. But actually what I found was throughout all of that we were constantly thinking about how we would re-become human, or kind of like re-experience our humanity in relation to incorporating or thinking through these other ways of being. And so I had spoken to a lot of different artists and some scientists. We were lucky enough to have Merlin Sheldrake just at the moment where his book was coming out in Becoming Fungus, so that was really lovely. And so we're thinking kind of like creatively, critically about this, as we've been talking about today, this kind of like continuous coexistence, and how different creatives have expressed that in their work. And I was invited to do a wonderful piece of work for Coventry, the Coventry Biennial, on Becoming Fungus with Sirens Crossing, and did various residencies. But it was a lot of working with other people or on other people's projects, and I hadn't really had the chance to apply all of this thinking and all of this kind of like new ways of working and kind of being on my own work. And so 2023 was a time. I've lived in this house for now 6 or 7 years. It's a small little tiny cottage in Wiltshire in Mere, and the garden, I've rewilded the garden, which sounds weird because that sounds like, but essentially I've kind of tried to take a back seat and just, you know, let things carry on and learn from these things that carry on and kind of grow and attack each other and all of this sort of stuff. And so what came out of that year of observation and working creatively was an exhibition that you very sweetly came along to as part of Somerset Art Weeks in September last year, called Becoming Here. And I didn't really realize until I gathered all of the work together that I was really interested, I mean, maybe obviously, I was really interested in line creation and how all of us in different ways, and I say all of us in terms of the human and non-human world, are involved in some kind of like line formation, and how that is made, whether it's made through marks, cracks, creases, incisions, eating things, decaying things. I had sort of I was working with fungus and sort of seeing the lines made by the pores on the fungal works, worms that were coming out of the fungal works and how they moved, and sort of trying to really, it just really opened up and kind of pluralized this idea of like language formation and what line is made of, and how these different animate lines essentially become part of the or almost how human language making is the most recent or a most recent heir to all of this non-human line making. And so seeing it that way around, you know, like we are the tiny like end point of like almost, you know, when you're, I don't know if you were told this as a researcher, but you know, there's like all of this knowledge and you're going to do this tiny little pinprick. And thinking of human knowledge like that, you know, and human language as this tiny little pinprick in this huge amount of like bubbling, you know, like thriving agency that is going on all the time. And so this Becoming Here was a few, it now feels very kind of like light and small, but kind of transcriptions or kind of like working with how writing as a line, writing as a drawing practice, writing as a kind of imprint of other things, other you know, animate beings on different surfaces. And then that is now coming into this new course that I'm running, which is towards an experimental ecology of line, which is really informed by Tim Ingold's work that I was, you know, introduced to in my PhD. And so you kind of see these kind of big arcs, you know, coming back. And because he's an anthropologist, he is looking at things from lots of different perspectives and lots of kind of formal different forms. And that's really, I feel, really helpful and compatible with a practice that is trying to bring in lots of plural agency, lots of kind of multi ways of line formation, and really trying to think about how language speaks with and forms out of this huge chattering, speaking, expressive world, you know. So that's where I am right now.
I have got two final questions, and they might go in slightly different directions. So one is that you mentioned collaborating with Merlin Sheldrake, and that you touched on that the Becoming project in one of its early iterations was a collaboration. You were working with other artists, and then you've mentioned that you've been running courses for a while now. You work with other artists and writers, and to support them, and also to collaborate on these new emerging forms and processes and practices. So to an extent, that I think that is it's a beautiful illustration of the collectivity of this process that you're talking about. And it's not only Camilla in the woods or Camilla and the woods, it's becoming a movement with a lot of collaboration between people who can work together on these projects. So I wanted to make that point. And my final question is, so do you think that the world, the animate world, is languaging? Do you think the animate world is speaking? Is there language happening?
I mean, obviously, sorry, I don't mean that like, because I feel like you feel that as well, but I mean, it's just so obvious. Like, human language wouldn't exist if there hadn't been all of this languaging already happening, you know, like we are just like the most recent like language on the scene, you know. This is what is sort of really sad about and maybe it's inevitable, because I'm sure kind of like birds will prioritize their own form of communication. Plants will, you know, like it's species specific. And but the kind of arrogance of thinking that human language is the only language, when obviously it is just the most recent formation of a whole lot of other speaking expressive modes that are happening. I mean, yeah, I don't know how to say it without sounding like an idiot, but it just seems like the most obvious thing. And it's really sad that it for so many years, centuries, you know, in human in I'm talking, and I know you know this as well, of a very kind of like small, relatively small, like, you know, human epoch in a particular part of the world with particular relationships to language, because yeah, but other civilizations have been better at acknowledging that human language is always a speaking with and speaking alongside rather than speaking for.
Yeah, that's such a, I think that's such a beautiful thought to leave us with. Camilla, thank you. And just to, on my part, and I'm sure you would agree with this as well, to invite and encourage anyone who's listening to go out and listen, and to speak with, and to find those forms of language in the world around us, in the living and animate world around us, not only simply through sound, but as you said, you know, through line or through decomposition. How is your part of the world speaking to you right now, and what is it saying?
Yeah,
it's an exciting place.
absolutely. Yeah, we need to get quiet and really listen. I think that is the thing. There's a lot of like, as creativity is wonderful, but listening is really, really important. You can't be a good creative without listening first. Yeah, you need to get quiet.
Co-creativity is where it's at.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for sharing your beautiful wisdom, your being, your practice, and all of the things that you've been learning and inquiring with through your work, Camilla. Really
Thank you so much.
How
Pleasure.
can people find you? Where can they...
So Singing Apple Press, so you can Google Singing Apple Press, or actually Google my name, but it's www.singingapplepress.com, and you can see links to workshops and links to recent work. You can see the links to the Becoming radio episodes there as well. So yeah,
do check those out. Thank you so much, Camilla.
thank you so much.